Hello everyone, welcome to Deep Sight. Let us take you on a journey through time and space to explore the profound connotations of ancient civilizations. In the previous videos, we told you the history of several major countries established by the early Germanic tribal peoples, so that we can understand how barbarism replaced civilization and gradually moved towards a new civilization in the course of European history. The history of the entire European Middle Ages has always been accompanied by the spiral evolution of church and royal power, unity and division, war and peace. The formation of the major countries in Europe today, including France, Germany, Italy, and Britain, is actually forged by the history of the last rising Germanic nation to be introduced to you in our medieval series. This is the protagonist of our video this time, the Frankish Kingdom. The Frankish Kingdom has a decisive influence on the formation of today's major European countries. The Frankish Kingdom existed in Central and Western Europe from the 5th to the 9th century. Its Latin name means the land of the Franks, and Franks means brave. They pioneered the feudal system in Europe. The territory of the Frankish Kingdom spans today's France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, the Low Countries, and northern Italy. The Franks, the main ethnic group of the Frankish Kingdom, originated within the territory of modern Belgium. The Franks were also a branch of the Germanic tribal alliance, and their roots can be traced back to the Germanic people in the 3rd century. They lived in the Rhine River basin, which is now the western part of Germany during this era. The Franks had similar migration motives to other Germanic peoples, especially during the period of Great Migration. During this period, multiple factors worked together to lead to widespread ethnic migration, among which the westward movement of the Huns was also an important triggering factor. The Huns' invasion of Germanic territory at the end of the 4th century forced many Germanic tribes to migrate to the Western Roman Empire, and the Franks were also affected by this. The pressure of the Huns led the Germans to find a new place to live. In addition to the threat of the Huns, the weakening of the Roman Empire, changes in the socio-economic structure, population growth, and changes in climatic conditions were also important factors for the Franks to leave their homes and move to the southwest of Europe. The weakening of the Roman Empire's border defenses and its inability to effectively resist foreign invasions provided opportunities for the migration of the Germanic people. In this process, the Franks gradually expanded and occupied most of Gaul. During the migration of the Franks, their social structure also changed, gradually evolving from a tribal alliance to a more centralized kingdom. Similarly, during the Great Migration of Nations, European history had a profound impact, promoting population growth, national integration, accelerating the formation of the feudal system, and promoting the spread and development of Christianity. In the early 4th century AD, the Franks successfully settled in northeastern Gaul within the Roman Empire as allies. At that time, the military power of the Roman Empire could no longer guarantee the security of its borders, so the Romans allowed foreigners called federators to enter the border areas of the empire to maintain security. This strategy of using barbarians to control barbarians also happened to the Goths. As we introduced in the past video, in the end, the Germanic people occupied the main military force of the Roman Empire, which eventually led to the complete collapse of the entire empire, and the Roman civilization was replaced by the barbaric Germanic people. This period of history has a striking similarity. Those who are familiar with Eastern history will find that this period occurred almost at the same time, and the nomadic peoples in the north began to migrate southward. In China, this stage is called the 16 Kingdoms period, from 304 to 439 AD, and was ruled by multiple non-Han regimes in turn for more than 100 years. Most of these regimes were established by ethnic groups from the northern grasslands, such as Xianbei, Jie, Di, Xiongnu, etc. These different ethnic groups are actually similar to different Germanic tribes. This period is characterized by political division and continuous wars, and it is also a process of ethnic integration and moving towards a more civilized life. The 16 Kingdoms period and the Great Migration of ethnic groups in Europe marked the decline of the old regime and the rise of new forces. In Europe, the Great Migration of ethnic groups lasted even longer, from about 300 AD to 700 AD, when ethnic groups such as Germanic and Slavic moved into the territory of the Roman Empire, eventually leading to the decline of the Western Roman Empire. These nations included the Goths, Vandals, and Franks, who settled in the frontier areas of the Roman Empire and gradually established their own kingdoms, becoming the main ethnic groups in the future of Europe. Unlike the Great Migration of nations in Europe, which led to the formation of a more lasting political entity, the regimes of the 16 kingdoms in the East were short-lived and changeable. During the 16 kingdoms period, most ethnic regimes changed from nomadic to farming, and the language, writing, life and customs were all syncretized as a result of ethnic integration and cultural penetration, and were eventually replaced by the unification of the Sui and Tang dynasties. Although they were called barbarians, the barbaric yearning for civilization was a good wish of all nations. If all barbaric nations could be accepted by the civilized world in that era, the trauma caused by war would be reduced to a minimum. This is also one aspect of the sadness of history. When the Western Roman Empire began to be destroyed and disintegrated by the Goths, there was a chaotic and vacuum zone of rule in France and northern Rome, and the Franks took the opportunity to expand their territory on a large scale. At the end of the 5th century, they migrated to the border of the Roman Empire, triggering frequent conflicts with the Roman Empire's army. The Franks showed excellent fighting skills and organizational talents, gradually expanding their territory and gradually conquering the areas of present-day France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. At this time, the Franks and the most important figure in the formation of today's European countries appeared: Clovis I. Clovis was born into a powerful family. He was the son of King Childeric I of the Frankish Kingdom and Queen Baina of Thuringia. Clovis I was born in Tournai, Belgium, about 466, which was then part of the Western Roman Empire. The Salian Franks were a northwestern branch of the early Franks who first appeared in historical records in the 4th century. They lived west of the Lower Rhine, in what is today the Netherlands and Belgium. The historical records are unclear about the founders of the Franks, but they are believed to have close ties with the Roman Empire and settled within it. The Franks were relatively large, and their territory included the southern part of today's Netherlands and part of western Germany. Their center of rule was near the Rhine, specifically in the region of Tournai, which would later become the capital of the Merovingian dynasty of the Frankish Kingdom. Clovis' father, Childeric I, was a pagan king, while his mother, Baina, was from Thuringia, a small state in present-day Germany. Clovis I succeeded his father as king of the Salian Franks. He became king in 481 AD, when he was only about 15 years old. In his early reign, Clovis first showed a talent for politics and diplomacy. He engaged in political and diplomatic dealings with the Catholic bishops of Gaul, influential figures who did not mind working with the Germanic king. For example, Clovis first received letters from Remigius, bishop of Reims, early in his reign that made it clear that the bishops saw themselves as natural advisors to the king, and even before Clovis first received his baptism of Nicene Christianity, he seemed to have recognized their rights and protected their property. Clovis' upbringing and his parents' background had an important impact on his later rule and decision-making. His efforts to unify the Frankish kingdom and his conversion to Christianity not only changed the religious outlook of the Frankish kingdom, but also laid the foundation for later European history. In the early days, Clovis was actually just one of many Frankish tribal leaders. After he took over the Roman administrative agency, he used it to unify other tribes and established the first country in history to unify the Frankish tribes. In 486 AD, Clovis first captured the enclave, and the Franks' territory expanded to the banks of the Loire River. During the expansion, the Franks confiscated a large number of lands from lords who fled or were killed, and Clovis became the largest landlord in the entire kingdom. In order to generate returns efficiently, he generously gave land to other nobles to win over the hearts of the people, and gradually evolved the fiefdom system. The formation of the early Germanic tribal monarchy was based on the people's worship of the king's mysterious power. From the late 19th century to the early 20th century, under the influence of pan-Germanism and racial superiority, the Germanic scholars represented by the German scholar Fritz Kern took the lead in proposing the bloodline of the Frankish monarchy. In their view, due to the dominant and strong effects of traditions and customs, the Merovingian kings, like other barbarian kings active on the political stage of Western Europe in the early Middle Ages, had some kind of supernatural mysterious power in the minds of the people. This mysterious power is only inherited in the royal bloodline and is expressed through the unique long hairstyle of the Merovingian royal family. The legitimacy of the Frankish monarchy is based on this bloodline rights. The Merovingian family took a step forward on this basis. Compared with the short life of other Germanic peoples, Clovis took the most important step in his life on Christmas Day in 496 AD. It was this step that laid the foundation for the successful counterattack of the Frankish Kingdom compared with other Germanic kingdoms. He converted to Roman Catholicism. Many historical records believe that Clovis's decision was influenced by his wife, a devout Catholic, even though her court was surrounded by the Christian Arians of the Germanic barbarian states. Clovis' conversion had a profound impact on the future of the Frankish Kingdom and Europe. With Clovis' political wisdom, his conversion should have been due to political motives. Clovis' conversion established a precedent for future Frankish kings to rule as Catholics. His close cooperation with the Roman Catholic Church made the Holy See the pillar of the Frankish kings, and Clovis became a strong iron fist of the Church. After Clovis converted to Christianity, the rule of the Franks was fully supported by the local Gauls and Romans. It also gave them a legitimate reason to unify other Germanic tribes and clean up pagans. There were two types of royal power in the Middle Ages. One was magical and the other was religious. The Merovingian royal power was based on military merit, magic, and mysterious concepts, and its deification process did not require the help of Christianity at all. It is precisely because of these striking characteristics that the Frankish monarchy at that time was often regarded as the personal achievement of the Merovingian kings. In the eyes of many people, the Frankish chieftain-style monarchy between the 5th century, imperial odes, les panegyriques impériaux, and the 9th century, mirrors of the monarch, les miroirs du prince, is not worthy of being in the upper class. It lacks a clear ideology, and its Christianization is at most personal and superficial. In short, the image of long hair and short knowledge, chevaux longs, IDs courts, not only made the Merovingian kings criticized by historians for a long time, but also made it difficult for the personalized Frankish monarchy to be associated with the Orthodox Christian monarchy guided by the Catholic faith. The establishment of the Frankish Kingdom marked the end of Roman rule and the beginning of the European Middle Ages. The Frankish kings implemented their orders by sending envoys, counts, and bishops, and at the same time tried to establish a unified church law throughout the Frankish Kingdom. At the Imperial Assembly in 511, Clovis also had the power to appoint bishops. In the early 6th century, he promulgated the Salic Law, a Frankish code in Latin, which was the basis of early feudal society in Europe. This year was the apex of Clovis' career and the end of his life. Clovis died in Paris, France on November 27, 511 AD. The historical records do not provide any detailed information about the cause of his death. His reign was a critical period of great changes in the Roman Empire and Europe. His death had a profound impact on the then Frankish Kingdom and later European history. The Frankish Kingdom went to the first division in history. At that time, the inheritance system was to divide the kingdom equally among all sons. The kingdom was immediately divided by his 4 sons into 4 independent kingdoms: Soissons, later Neustria, Paris, Orleans, later Burgundy, and Metz, later Austrasia. Although some kings of these 4 kingdoms were occasionally able to unify the entire kingdom, under the influence of the Germanic tradition, the kingdoms that were finally unified were often united and divided by the sons after the king's death. Among these countries, except for the Kingdom of Paris, the other 3 countries have established a major domus, that is, the chief steward of the palace. The major domus in France and the prime minister in China have similar status and functions in their respective histories. Initially, the major domus was the king's steward, responsible for the internal affairs of the palace, managing royal wealth, developing royal industries, and directing the internal affairs of the palace. As a representative of powerful regional nobles, the major domus also has the title of Prince du Palais or Duc du Palais, as well as the title of Duke of Neustria, Austrasia, or Burgundy. Because the king ignored state affairs, this period formed the lazy king era, and political affairs were entrusted to the major domus, which gradually seized the power of the country. After the death of Dagobert I in 639 AD, his son was able to inherit a unified kingdom again, but the real power of the country was in the hands of the major domus and the queen mother. As time went on, the major domus gained greater political power and gradually replaced the Merovingian monarchs as the actual rulers of the Frankish kingdoms. In the late Merovingian dynasty, many monarchs were used as puppets by the mayor of the palace. and these monarchs were even called Roisfaniants, kings without action. In 687, Pepin, the mayor of the palace in Austrasia, defeated the ruler of the entire kingdom, paving the way for the rise of the Pepin dynasty and the Carolingian dynasty, but Pepin did not dare to usurp power at that time. It is worth mentioning that the mayor of the palace was allowed to pass on from father to son, which further consolidated his power. After Pepin's death in 714 AD, there was a power struggle in the country, and in 719, Pepin's illegitimate son Charles Martel won. Martel, who was known for his cruelty, faced internal and external troubles. There were always different tribes in the kingdom trying to overthrow his rule. In 732, he defeated the invading Arabs at the Battle of Tours together with his former enemies. He is considered the savior of the Catholic faith in the Western world. He then went east to defeat the Frisians, Saxons, Bavarians, and Alemanni, and these victories further consolidated his rule. In addition, he supported the missionary work of Saint Boniface in these areas. After the death of the Frankish king in 737, he became the sole ruler of the empire, but like his father, he did not accept the title of king. According to Germanic tradition, before his death, Matt divided the kingdom between his two sons, Pepin III and Carloman. Dear friends, this is the content of our historical exploration in this issue. We will introduce you more about the ups and downs of the subsequent dynasties of the Frankish Kingdom in the next episode of the video. You can click on the content of the next episode at the end of the video. Thank you for watching and accompanying me. I am your time travel navigator, Stardust. Learn from people and you can understand gains and losses. Learn from history and you can know the rise and fall. Let us see the distant past and foresee a bright future. See you next time.